Looking back on my life, I've spent 33 years of my life as either a student or a teacher. That's literally 75% of my life. You can do the math to figure out how old I am. Which is actually very strange and ironic, as I actually detested school in my first decade of education, particularly when I was in primary school. You may have remembered me mentioning that my parents wanted to give my brother and I more opportunities than they had when they were growing up. And so they put me into a French Immersion school when I started year one. Basically, that means in year one, everything that we did at school, except for English class, was actually in French, and none of us could speak French. So that's one way you learn a language, by immersing yourself. Neither of my parents knew French, but as we lived in Canada, they thought that it might be helpful for their kids to know French because we might be able to get a good job one day if we were bilingual. By the way, most Canadians are not actually bilingual. That's a myth. Just so you know, most know as much French as you might know Indonesian. But my parents wanted us to be bilingual because they wanted to give us a good thing. Of course, moving to Australia, the whole French thing has not been as useful as they had hoped, but it was helpful in other ways. However, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that the school that they had me put into was made of mostly the children of rich working professionals. My classmates, there was some who were the children of doctors, some business CEOs, some university professors. Of course, there was some parents that perhaps were not so high on the social scale, but they were all at least much higher than where my dad was on the scale of things in my class. My dad worked in a factory. And as far as I knew, I was the only one who had a parent who was an immigrant. All the kids in my class had cable television. Some of you may know what that means. Basically, they had homes where they had 50 channels to choose from for watching. They often had more than one TV, whereas we had one TV and we needed a metal clothes hanger just to watch a couple of channels. So I wasn't really up on the characters of shows that the kids watched, or everyone else watched for that matter. I also didn't have the fancy, expensive toys that everyone else had, or at least I thought they were pretty fancy and expensive. Also, this is something that you take for granted here in Australia, but in Canada, almost every single school, whether it's a private school or a public school, there is no school uniforms. There's none. And although those of you who are students may think that's awesome, what it meant for me is that while everyone else in my class wore trendy clothes with designer labels, I wore secondhand clothes that were no-name brand clothes, and I stuck out like a sore thumb. My parents did everything they could to provide, and they did provide what I needed. But they couldn't provide the luxuries that everyone else in my class seemed to have. And that was hard. Adding to all of that, I was the shortest kid in the class. I was one of the first boys to have a deep voice, one of the first students to have pimples. I struggled with academics, which is probably strange because some of you know that I did a doctorate, but I actually struggled with academics. And I'd be lying to you if I told you I only got teased a little bit. The truth is, I was actually bullied relentlessly, at least till year 6. And basically the pressure got so bad one day that I literally snapped. And I picked up one of the smaller bullies and threw him just like I saw wrestlers do on TV. But I was looked down on. I was verbally abused every day. I was always the last to be chosen for any teams or groups. I was excluded from most events outside of school unless one of the parents took pity on me and forced their kid to invite me to their party. I was shoved and punched, and honestly, I don't actually remember most of my primary school years. And I realized this when I was in year 8 at the same school, and some of the kids asked me if I remembered certain things that they saw kids do to me, and I actually didn't remember them. So basically, my mind had actually blocked things out of my head because it was literally just that bad. And the reality is, and I'm very ashamed for this, but I actually dreamed of one day that I would show them, that I would get revenge. And I don't mean in like a crazy way, but I mean I would actually get them by showing them I was not the person that they thought I was. And I wanted to get them for the cruelty and the injustice that was done to me. They told me that I would never amount to anything. Maybe a janitor. That was pretty much it. I was told that no girl would ever want to be with me and that I would be alone forever. And this wasn't just a one-off comment. This was a weekly comment by both boys and girls in my class. So I had no friends at this school, at least until year 7. And so in my head, I swore one day that I would show them all that they were wrong. And I had this dream of going to a school reunion one day in a fancy car, earning a big salary, with an amazingly beautiful woman as my date, just to show them stories of adventure and travel and success. But the worst part was that I had hoped that they would show up to the reunion as school dropouts, weight problems, divorces, all sorts of things that you wouldn't really want to wish on your worst enemies. But they were actually my worst enemies at that point in my life, and I wished it on them. Because in my mind, I not only wanted to show them that they were wrong, but I wanted them to suffer with all the things that they put on me. And even though that painful chapter of my life changed when I moved to another part of Canada, and even though I later became a Christian, it wasn't until my mid-20s that one day I just caught myself thinking in my head, if they could only see me now. Successful teacher at a private school, world traveler, living in Australia, married to a beautiful Australian woman. I wish they knew how much better my life is now. And then Jesus interrupted my daydream, and he told me, just let it go. I was still holding on to events that had happened well over a decade before. I hadn't seen any of these kids for almost 15 years. More than half my life had gone by. And yet, they weren't thinking of me, and yet I was still thinking of them, and they were still causing me bitterness. I realized that I had never actually forgiven them, even though I had been a Christian for years. I still wanted to take justice into my own hands, but God reminded me that vengeance did not belong to me, that it was my duty to love my enemies, and that justice was his department, not mine. And while I might not be happy with how God deals with those who caused me injustice, at the time I wasn't happy about God having it. I needed to remember that God also has to contend with all the times where I was the one who was not fair to others, where I was the one who was actually the bully or the mean person, because it wasn't just one-sided in other times in my life. And as Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. We've been looking at the attributes of God as we have been making our way through a series called How Great is Our God? And it should be up on the screen here, but it's not. If you guys can switch to one of these screens. No. There we go. And this Sabbath, we're going to be considering God as a God of justice. First of all, what is justice? Some people might imagine a courtroom scene. Others might be thinking of a superhero stopping the bad guys, while others might simply imagine someone getting what they deserve. But our picture of justice, it doesn't usually line up with biblical justice, what God's idea of justice actually is. Justice as a concept, according to the Bible, is simply making things right. If things are not as they should, it's simply putting things back the way they should be. So today we're going to look at the different kinds of justice that there is and how they relate to God. First one being distributive justice. Where is it? Awesome. Now, distributive justice, distributing, think of it that way, is concerned with how goods, honors, and obligations are distributed within a community. In other words, it's about someone being given a fair share. So whether we're talking about income, you being paid properly or being given the right amount of work that you should be, or anything that involves handing out something that everyone else should get. It's all about equality. It's about being equal. That's what distributive justice is. Now, if anybody here has played the game, the board game, I don't mean the card game, but the board game of Monopoly. Has anyone suffered through that? I love the card game. The card game is quick. The card game takes a lot more brains, in my opinion. If you don't have the card game, get it. You can have a game in 10 minutes. It's great. But if you have played the board game of Monopoly, you're probably familiar with the fact that even though the game starts out as everyone being given the same amount of money, after some time, mostly due to chance, partially due to strategy, someone ends up having much more than everyone else. And slowly this person will own everything on the board, which is why it's called Monopoly. That's what a monopoly is, where you own everything. Did you know that Monopoly was never meant to be a board game? Especially not a family board game. That was not what it was designed for. It was actually designed as an educational tool to illustrate the reason why commercial and government monopolies should be illegal. The whole point of the game is to show you why we should not have a completely free market. It was designed to show that there should be rules to prevent someone from being able to own too much stuff. Why the rich need to be taxed more heavily as an example of this. Because in the end, just like the board game, if you don't have all these rules, you end up having just a few people owning everything and the majority of people owning nothing. That's why this thing was created, not as a game, but as an educational tool. And ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that is why the board game Monopoly causes so many fights and arguments and broken relationships. Jodine's told me about when they used to play as kids. One of the neighbor kids used to come and he'd lose and he'd get angry and he'd actually go home crying. If anyone's played that game too much, you can relate. I've noticed that the original version of the board game Monopoly doesn't get played much at our Springwood board game night. Maybe that's why so many people enjoy the night. If you want to look at how much God tries to implement rules that protect the poor, Read up on Leviticus 25. We're not going to go through it today. I thought about it because it's actually very fascinating. But through Moses, God actually sets up a reset button for their economy to keep everything fair. It's almost like you're playing Monopoly, someone's getting the most, and suddenly someone wipes the board and you start again. God literally puts that into their society. It was called Jubilee. Really awesome concept. The Israelites never followed it, unfortunately. But it's an interesting system. But instead, we're going to look at a story that happens during Samuel's time. Happens in 1 Samuel chapter 30. And they're coming to the end of David being a fugitive. And while still hiding from Saul, David and his men, they briefly work as double agent mercenaries. Yes, you heard me right. Double agent mercenaries. For one of the Philistine kings. And you'd think, isn't that the bad guy? Yes. But this bad guy thinks that David and his men are on their side and says, yeah, that's great, you go get them. And he thinks that they're going to attack the Israelites, but instead they're attacking the allies of the Philistines and not leaving anyone alive, so the king doesn't know. It's actually quite a dodgy story of what David does, and it almost gets them into hot water if you read it. But as they come back to their base after deciding they shouldn't do that anymore, they find that the town that their wives and children are in has been pillaged by raiders. You know, the thing that they were actually doing to other people? Except it wasn't as bad as what they did, because their wives and kids hadn't been killed, because that's what they would have done. Instead, they had all been captured and taken away to become slaves. So David and his 600 men, they set out to hunt down these raiders and get their families back. But David and his men had just spent weeks traipsing around the countryside, fighting constantly with enemies. And so, as you can imagine, they're pretty tired. They're pretty wrecked. In fact, 200 of the 600 mighty men, and that's what their title was, mighty men. They're so exhausted. These are like special soldiers. They're so exhausted that they actually have to leave these 200 men behind, and they get them instead to stay at the base to make sure nothing else gets taken. So David pushes on with 400 men instead. And after finding out that it was the Amalekites who did this, they took their families and they find out where they're camping. David and the 400 men rush into the Amalekite camp. They take out the raiders. They completely slaughter them, even though they had completely outnumbered David and his men. They kill all but 400 of them. So you know how many there must have been, because 400 is how many David had. 400 actually escaped. The rest are all gone, and they end up getting back not only all their wives and their kids, but they also get all the treasures that these raiders had from all these other raids that they did. And so when the 400 march back and they meet up with the 200, you know, the 200 guys who were tired and they stayed behind to guard the base, some of the soldiers out of that 400 who went, they actually pipe up and they say this: they didn't go with us, so they can't have any of the plunder that we recovered. Give them their wives and children and tell them to be gone. Pretty harsh. Not long before, these guys were working with these guys. Now, I've met some people who think that those who have jobs and money should not have to pay for the health care of those who don't. I met a lot, particularly in one country I lived in, you can probably guess which one it was, who believed that wealth and well-being were an attribute of those who worked hard. And if someone didn't have wealth or well-being, it meant that they weren't very hard workers. I can't get my head around that. And they thought that those who didn't have much wealth or health, they were just freeloaders. They were freeloading the system. As someone who's been unemployed at times, that's offensive. Tells me a bit about how privileged those people must be. But did you know that the scripture actually refers to these guys who say this, who had a similar mindset as some of the people that I've mentioned? They actually call them evil troublemakers. David, however, was not like this, and he stood up for those who didn't have the stamina to keep running in verses 23 to 25, and he says, "No, my brothers, don't be selfish with what the Lord has given us. He has kept us safe and has helped us defeat the band of raiders who attacked us." Who will listen to you when you talk like this? It's like, you guys are just being awful people. We share and share alike, those who go to the battle and those who guard the equipment. From then on, David made this a decree and a regulation for Israel, and it's still followed today, or at least at the time this was written. God knows what people are like. And it doesn't matter how great a person you are, we all have sin in us. And God knows how the powerful tend to get corrupted. Everyone probably knows a saying, power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's why you have dictatorships. God influences Moses and David to make laws for people being given a fair share. And he still cares for those who are in need. Let's look at the next type of justice, procedural justice. This is the element of justice concerned with the application of the law rather than with the content of the law. What it means, the word procedure is in there. Distributive justice is about everyone having a fair share. This one's actually very Australian. It's about everyone having a fair go. Okay? So it means not only do you have rules that are fair, but you need to make sure these rules are implemented well. People get really excited about procedural justice when they're watching sports. And they see the ref make a call that they don't agree with. That's procedural justice. That's what it is. Making sure the rules are applied properly. It's how decisions are made. That's what it's all about. I remember when I was in my third year of my bachelor's degree. And myself and a friend of mine who was a classmate, we were brought into the academic office. And we were thinking, why are we bringing in here? We didn't cheat or anything. What's going on? Both of us had started our education degree together at the same time when we were both doing a major in biology. Well, they sat us down and they spoke very nicely to us, and they told us that our specific curriculum for our program was changing for the better. And we thought, okay, that's cool. However, the problem with the new course was that my friend and I, we had done courses that were no longer valid. We're like, what? Courses that we had put time into. And for those who've been to college or university, you know that every credit costs a lot of money. And we had to take an entire year's worth of new courses to make up for the change. This is what we were told. So we would finish our degree a year later than what we were planning to, and we also had to pay for all the fees for that new year. Does that sound fair to you? I hope you're thinking no. It wasn't fair at all. Now, I was much less outgoing and much less astute than I am now at that point in time. And I left the meeting confused and not knowing what to do. My friend, however, told her father, who was very astute and who was a businessman. And he very kindly, or perhaps it wasn't very kindly, he called the university and he told them that if his daughter and myself don't graduate as we were supposed to, and if we have to pay any extra fees that he was going to take them to court and he was going to win. Procedural justice. Within a day or two, I was told, don't worry about that meeting that you had. You're going to graduate on time. Just forget about the whole thing. You can tell I've forgotten about it. Our procedure is important. We often yawn about rule books and stuff, but when you're in trouble, you have to, that's very important. How the rules are carried out are just as important as the rules themselves. Another story of David, except one that does not cast him in a very good light, that has to do with procedural justice, was the story of David covering up a crime that he had done while he was king. This is found in 2 Samuel 11. Most people know the story of how David took advantage of Bathsheba, who was the wife of one of his most loyal soldiers, and probably it was one of his good friends. That makes it even worse, doesn't it? Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was actually named in the Bible as one of David's famous 30 mighty men. So he was the special ops soldiers out of the 600. He was one of the best out of the 600. He was a man of great honor, but not wanting to be found out because Bathsheba became pregnant with David's child. Talk about awkward. David has Uriah, one of his very loyal soldiers, strategically killed on the battlefield to cover up his affair with Bathsheba because, hey, she could just say she had it was her husband's kid, and it's terrible that he's dead, and oh no, now David can. And David was thinking, yeah, no one will ever know. However, God knew, and David was the king of God's nation at the time. And so God steps in through a very brave prophet named Nathan and calls David on his injustice. And he declares that there's going to be a consequence that's going to take place. Uriah, unfortunately, does not get to see justice carried out because he was killed. He may or may not have known that he had been betrayed. My hunch is that, in my personal opinion, is that Uriah probably knew something was going on. But justice is carried out nonetheless. It'll be quite the conversation one day when David and Uriah meet in heaven. That'll be an interesting, hey, how's it going? Good. Yeah, it's funny how I didn't make it in that, why everyone pulled back. Yeah, about that. Anyway, finally, let's talk about the kind of justice that seems to underpin everything that God does. And that is restorative justice. It's a system of justice where the offender's consequence is itself a response in correcting not only the offense, but reforming the person who did the crime in the first place. Many scholars believe that the entire Bible is one story of restorative justice that's being carried out on humans. And I would agree with that. The story I told you at the beginning took quite a bit of prayer for me to tell you that bit of my life. I wanted to get back at those who hurt me. In other words, I wanted them to pay for what they had done to me. That's another kind of justice called retributive justice. And basically, it's not based on correcting the crime that happened. It's not based on reforming the person who did the crime, but it's all about punishment. It's all about making them pay for what they did, regardless of whether they're a different person at the end or not, regardless of if whatever happened gets fixed or not. And while retributive justice can be found in the Bible, it's not the method that God prefers to use. In fact, we can see this best when Jesus is carrying out his ministry on earth. Even though Jesus is continually helping and doing good to others, he is almost constantly, emotionally, and psychologically attacked by the authorities of the day. And in the end, as you probably know, Jesus is physically abused and tortured for doing absolutely nothing wrong. And yet, even though he could read the minds of people and he knew everything, even though he could have shamed the religious leaders publicly by telling everybody what they actually did privately, that was terrible, he doesn't smear their names. He could have, but he doesn't. And even though Jesus could have told the crowds of people to lash out at the authorities who were causing him problems, he could have done that. They were stirred up enough to make him king, which means they probably would have done anything he would have said. He doesn't do that. Instead, Jesus actually tells them, you need to listen to those who are in authority unless they go against God's word. Even though Jesus could have excluded his enemies from being healed or even having salvation, he doesn't do that. Jesus heals the daughter of one of the synagogue leaders. He heals the servant of a centurion. The Romans were the enemies of Judah. When Peter gets angry and they're actually going to arrest Jesus, Peter lashes out and cuts off the ear of one of the guys who came to arrest Jesus. Even then, Jesus' response is, Peter, knock it off. Picks up the ear, puts it back on his head, and it's all good as new. He didn't have to do that. Jesus even asked God to forgive those who were nailing him to the cross while they were nailing him to the cross. Jesus could have called a squadron of terrifying angels. I mean, if one angel can flick the door of the tomb open, imagine what they could actually do if a whole squad came. He could have called a whole squad of these terrifying angels down when he was arrested, and he says that to Peter. But he doesn't do that or any of these things. Jesus does not carry out vengeance or retributive justice. Even though out of any human being alive, he should have, out of any of us, done that. He not only deserved to do it to other people, but he was the one who actually could have done it because he was that powerful. But instead, Jesus always offers mercy. He always warns offenders of what will happen if they continue. He always advises people to turn the other cheek and to walk the extra mile. And some people think, oh, Jesus was a pushover. He was not a pushover. If he was a pushover, he wouldn't have even gotten involved in what he was saying. When you study the words of Jesus properly, you can read between the lines that he is always challenging people to stand up against those who oppress. But the thing is with Jesus, he's encouraging people to do so in a loving manner and in a peaceful, non-violent manner. He's not a pushover. It takes a lot more strength to be able to calmly tell someone to stop doing something when they're holding a weapon than to just go in and gun them down. Jesus doesn't only tell people to love their enemies, but he models it to the extreme, which, by the way, causes some of his enemies to become his most loyal followers. You've got this guy named Saul, who organizes the death of the first Christian martyr, Stephen. He goes on to hunt down Christians, throwing many in prison, killing other ones, just for the crime of following their conscience. And what does God do to him? If God was like us, he would have just lit him up. But he doesn't. God turns up and he scares him, he stuns him, he gives him temporary blindness to think about how blind Saul had been with those who disagreed with him. And then when Saul is repentant, Jesus gives Saul a restorative consequence. He gives him a new mission. He tells him to do the opposite of what he's been doing and become an advocate for the new faith, except do it just as passionately as when you were killing people. He tells him that he has to follow this path of peace even when people treat him with violence. And if you've read about what happens to Paul, man, he was just, there's a reason why he had a scribe writing things for him. His hand was probably so deformed from being beaten so many times. He can't write anymore. Look at the new restored person that Saul becomes when he even gets a new name called Paul. God's justice is always paired with his mercy. You never have one without the other. And every now and then I think about what those kids back in the 80s did to me, and I wonder where they are. Sometimes I even try to go on Facebook and look. I still at times want them to see how wrong they were about me and who I've become. But now I wish that I could tell them that my success is because of Jesus. And it's my prayer that they have met him like I have, or they will meet him, and they have turned their lives around in response. How will you respond to God and his justice? It reads in Isaiah 1:16-18, "Wash yourselves and make yourselves clean. Put away the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Rebuke the oppressor. Defend the fatherless. Plead for the widow. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins be like scarlet." Scarlet is like blood color. "They shall be white as snow. Though they are red and crimson, they shall be as wool." How will you respond to this today? When someone does you wrong, or someone who has done you wrong, will you continue to want to take things into your own hands? How about when you do the wrong thing? How will you respond to this?